Welcome to Connected. I'm your host, Haley Trimboli, and whether you're PhD curious or you're currently navigating your PhD program or wondering what your fellow graduates are up to, this podcast is your go-to for inspiring stories, actionable insights, and meaningful connections within the PhD community. Today, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Trevor Gerhardt, a global educator, researcher, TEDx speaker, and thought leader in work-based learning. Originally from South Africa and now based in the UK, Trevor's career spans decades and continents. He earned his EDD from Canterbury Christ Church University, focusing on the training of curates in the Church of England and how that shapes future ministry. His journey didn't stop there. Trevor has become a force in the field of experiential learning, with roles ranging from associate professor to curriculum developer, podcast host, and YouTube educator. He's worked with institutions across the world, championed degree apprenticeships, mentored countless students, and delivered insights from the classroom to international conferences. Yeah, so welcome to the podcast, Trevor.
Thank you very much.
Where does this podcast find you today?
So I am based in Kent, the Garden of England, which for those of you who are now opening a map to try and figure out where that is, you're looking at southeast England. So if London, which everybody knows, was like a clock, we are situated around number 5. So just outside number 5.
I mean, well, it sounds beautiful just with the description you provide, the gardens. Great. Well, let's just jump right into it. So sort of starting at the beginning here, what sparked your decision to pursue a doctorate? Like, was this a moment or a gradual realization?
Well, it all started actually before deciding to do my doctorate. When I was doing my master's in education, training and development in education and learning, I had discovered in a fresh way, in a new way, the whole concept of professionalism. Not professionalization, which is the bureaucratic kind of let's control people, but more professionalism. One of the things that fascinated me when I discovered this, particularly having been in England then for quite a number of years, was that lawyers, doctors, and clergy were the first professions in the UK. And the reason being is because they were pretty much the only ones who could read in English society. So their roles were not just, kind of stuck to religion or medicine or something like that. They acted as registrars, etc., etc. So this concept fascinated me. And when I then worked for the Church of England, which is, although they're not officially the state church, they would have been one of those earlier professions. They were part of the landed gentry. And so that fascinated me. I wanted to kind of get into that a little bit more. Working for the Church of England, not being an Anglican, it helped me to get to grips with the context within which I was working. And I, at that point in time, began to realize that my expertise lay in experiential education, and the training of curates, which is priests in training, followed a very, very similar role. They were placed for 3 years under the expertise of a full-time priest to basically learn the trade. But I was one of 6 of 41 dioceses that did further educational training. And they weren't so happy about that. So hence, I was very intrigued. What is education? Why do we study these things? Are we just suckers for punishment? Are we bored? Do we have too much money to spend? Why bother doing an MA? Why bother doing a PhD? What does it do? And I particularly explored the route of how to do it through experiential learning, but also, secondly, for those who are engaged in more kind of professions, so I guess kind of higher white-collar kind of skilled jobs, how does that educational piece of paper, how does that add to you as a professional? So self-regulation, the years of training, the expertise, mastering something. So that led me to the ED. So personally for myself would be one of the reasons to want to progress, but also to continue to understand the role that education has in societies, rather than just knowledge, but how we shape citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always like to know, like from my guests here, like, did you sort of contextually have others within your environment who are exploring these questions and like taking this sort of path? Or was this sort of uncharted territory for you as far as like understanding what it would look like if you said like, yes, okay, I have this question and I want to move forward with it?
I mean, it's very interesting. At the time that I was working for the Church of England, most of those who decided to come into the priesthood would be mid to late 40s. In other words, this was kind of a retirement plan almost in some ways. And I remember one of the guys that started to train, he was a qualified lawyer. He was a qualified medical doctor, and now he was becoming a qualified priest, which in terms of professionalism, I mean, he was ticking all the boxes. But
Yeah.
what I was fascinated by all of this was the journey that they were taking in terms of identity, particularly because you were involving religious aspects. I mean, it really does go deep. And how does, for example, doing further education, how does that shape your own sense of identity? So I don't think there were many around who were asking the kind of questions I was asking and were being intrigued by the kind of things that intrigued me. But nonetheless, I could see why it would be important, particularly in the forming of citizens. What does that mean? And do certain citizens have a higher voice than others because of their educational status? Does that, the higher order thinking, the criticality, does that enable us to engage as active citizens in any society in a higher responsible way than others? And therefore we hold a responsibility because we have that higher form of education. These were the kind of questions that intrigued me. Rowan Williamson, who was then the Archbishop of the Church of England, just as I started working, kept using this phrase for not common knowledge, for the kind of common benefit of society. He kept using this kind of common, and it did make me really think, particularly in terms of professionalism. In education, for example, in England at least, we have what's called teaching assistants in classrooms. So where there would be a situation of a child who is in a vulnerable position in education and a board gets put together to discuss this, to what degree does that teaching assistant have a voice? How much authority do they have in the room? Is that based on salary? Is that based on education? So these are interesting questions around our own professional understanding, identity, status, and what that means in society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one commonality on these conversations of folks who have pursued this sort of level of education is that there's some sort of burning question that is at the end of the day driving you forward to continue furthering yourself, your education. And so I don't see that as being unusual in any way. So you've had quite a varied international career. Why did you choose Canterbury Christ Church University and that? You talked a little bit around the research focus, but I'm curious to understand like why you landed exactly at that particular university.
I mean, a lot of its location in England. I obviously wanted to be part of a cohort which would allow me to be with people physically. This is all pre-COVID, so I didn't want to do anything online or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Canterbury Christ Church was celebrating a jubilee celebration, so 100 years. Was it 100 or 50 years? I can't remember now. And they were putting together a particular cohort of students as part of that Jubilee cohort. And because Canterbury Christ Church has a religious background, they were looking for people from all walks of life that would be part of this kind of cohort that would look into these kinds of issues or research focus. So that was one thing that attracted me, to be able to have the freedom to be able to discuss these kinds of things within a research context, but not purely a kind of a theological degree, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Secondly, it was close in terms of where I was living. And thirdly, the way in which it was being offered. So we had intensive weekends. So we'd all, I mean, most of the insightful conversations happened around the pub in the evening with a glass of wine or a pint of Guinness. And it's that kind of environment that I was after. I didn't just want to sit and listen to lectures. I wanted to debate. I wanted to have discussions. I wanted to agree and disagree with colleagues. So kind of shape and form my own thinking. And the program just suited me really well in terms of what was offered and how we could do that.
Yeah, and I think the cohort model is quite strong and adds a valuable aspect to the studies because not everybody I think goes through that actual sort of structure. Just curious, like what were some of your cohort members doing as well? Because I think that really influences the
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. So I remember one of them was a radiographer, and again they were exploring their identity as a radiographer,
Okay.
particularly from a religious perspective. Another person was working in schools; they were a head of department. Another one was a principal. Another person was a head of a department in a university. One guy was from, I think he was from Tobago, from the Caribbean islands, was his heritage. He was over here, kind of on a furlough slash kind of lecture exchange program, and was looking to go back and actually be involved in the statewide educational policies and so on. So the variety of people was partly actually what made it such a rich learning environment. I'm still in touch with actually quite a few of them post that, which again is a great thing about doing a PhD, is that it's not just about the knowledge and what you're learning, but it's actually about the friendships, the colleagues, the networks that you develop as you do this. I must say as well, just by and by, the other thing that really made Canterbury Christ Church quite attractive is that they were part of what's called Erasmus Plus. So in Europe, we get together with other universities across Europe for study cohorts. And I got selected as part of a doctoral study cohort. We went to Joensuu in Finland, hosted by the University of East Finland, together with a university from Milan, Italy, university in Lithuania, and there was one more. There was us, Finland, Canterbury Christ Church. Oh my goodness! Turkey. It was a university from Turkey, from Istanbul. So again, that made an absolutely rich learning environment when you were together with PhD or EdD colleagues from across the university, because I was in the educational department, but across the entire university, met with these universities from across Europe and Asia. And again, that was a massive enrichment process. I think we were 3 or 4 weeks we were in Finland studying together, learning together, discussing methodology and so on. So again, this is what it offered to be a part of this cohort. You had that opportunity as well.
Yeah, and it wasn't just like a conference per se, but we were actually coming together, and like it was part of the program you were already in. You're learning the content or and then having discussions, networking, etc.
Correct.
Yeah, how lovely, amazing. I'm sure that was quite valuable and fantastic. And so did you did you go into the program with a clear plan for how you would apply your research, your degree sort of afterwards, or did that unfold along the way?
I did. The reason why I'm laughing is, again, that the Church of England is very theatrical in what they do, in the sense that they wear robes and all these kind of things. So quite often when these kind of occasions happen, because I'm not Anglican, I always just had a suit on, and everyone else was, it's kind of like at a graduation ceremony, right? Everyone's wearing these amazing gowns and all these kind of things. I always stood out like a bit of a sore thumb because I was just wearing a suit. So in some ways, knowing that I would be a doctor, and I had agreed this with everyone beforehand, that when these occasions happened, they would allow me to wear my doctoral outfit, which I bought out of my own pocket so that I have it. So in some ways there was that kind of intention. I could fit in a little bit more, although I stood out because my gowns are red. I stood out like anything. But yeah, it was about wanting to progress as well. My background is kind of training and development. I was a continual professional development officer. And I'd reached a particular point where I was not really going to progress in my own career unless I continue to invest in my education. And it was straight after that. It's probably after I graduated, probably a couple of months after that, maybe 6 or 7 months later, that I returned full-time back as a faculty in a university. And I don't think that opportunity would have opened up unless I had my doctoral qualification. It made me extremely competitive, put it that way, together with all the experience I had in work-based learning.
Yeah. And not all individuals who pursue a doctoral level education have prior experience, like actually maybe being in the workforce. They might just jump into that right after other studies, whether a bachelor's and going into that or a master's, et cetera. Like how did having that experience in the training and development space beforehand, like did that add value to your lens as you were in the program or the conversations that you were having?
A great question. I think that previous background probably shaped and influenced most of the decisions I made in terms of the kind of format of study that I wanted. In the UK, there's 3 kind of ways in which you could pursue, level 8 kind of study. studying, be it a professional doctorate or a PhD. One is the traditional PhD where you almost, they find you 6 years later as a skeleton in a closet because, you've somehow survived this process on your own. I didn't really want that. I'm not that kind of academically minded where I just wanted to crack on and get lost in stuff for 6 years and appear at the end. On the other hand, we also have what's called a PhD by publication. I didn't want to go down that route completely. At that point in time, I had not really published. It scared me a little bit. Whereas the EdD approach was really, really attractive. 7 taught modules. So you still were in a kind of a classroom setting, although these were over weekends, they were residentials. You could still engage with your colleagues. You could debate. You could do this and the other. And then you had the thesis at the end. And because of my training and development background, liking a particular way in which you are engaged as a professional, as a mature adult in education, the EdD process suited me down to the T. And so hence, the choice of it was because of that background, definitely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for others considering a similar sort of approach to the program, what's something, you wish you might have known before applying that would be valuable for others?
I don't think there's anything new that I would want to know now. I was the first one to finish. I was the first one to graduate. Many colleagues who met me almost 2-3 years later when they finally completed the programs. And it is difficult. I think we were 22, 6 of us completed. So this level of study is not for the faint-hearted. And people didn't pull out because they gave up. They pulled out for numerous reasons. It's a lot of hard work, hard time, particularly for mature adults with families. You are managing so much and trying to squeeze this in as well. But what I had as a huge benefit was I had a very, very clear idea from the start why I was doing it and what I wanted to do. Yeah. So although they were kind of going through the 7 modules, trying to figure out what their thesis research was going to be, I knew from the start. In fact, I was so clear about what I needed, and to avoid self-plagiarism, I had already worked out which of the particular modules work I was going to actually try and get published so I could cite myself, so that it wouldn't be self-plagiarism. I can actually cite the work that I'd already get published. And again, 6 to 12 months is going to take that to be published in anyway. So I had already begun to work out which modules I was going to use to begin to create some work that I could cite in my thesis. To avoid self-plagiarism. I was very, very clear what I was going to do from the word go. Now, not everybody would know that, but I think if you are very driven about wanting to research something, you're very clear about what area you want to master and develop, it's really good to then do that studying, because you are streaks ahead of everybody else who's still trying to figure it out. And I actually got a lot more enjoyment out of it because I wasn't kind of lost in a dark room trying to find my way. I knew exactly what I was looking for. And my research was targeted in that particular way.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I experienced that within my own cohort, was that some folks really knew coming in, and that drove them through their whole program. You had sort of that mix of people who knew a little or did not really at all, and were sort of exploring and open. But, I think that's an interesting, did you knew what you were doing? So did it seem like the modules, the coursework was just further adding value to that? Or was there some shifts, slight shifts as you started going through, or you were very firm and it came out that way?
Well, I was very firm, but my supervisors and the staff kept trying to persuade me in other ways. Which is why I'm laughing. Because I was part of a Julie cohort, there was this kind of expectation, because the program was being funded for this reason, that there had to be some kind of religious slant in whatever it is we were doing. So I remember when I produced my first draft, and I had 3 of my supervisors in front of me, they all in different ways kept saying to me, "Where's God in all of this?" And I'm going, well, if I wanted God in this, I would have done a theological PhD. This is not a theological PhD, it's an educational one. And so I had to keep holding my ground, in the sense that I was clearly, my research context was the Church of England. So there was going to be this kind of slant, but it wasn't purely about that. It was about work-based learning. I had a very clear indication that I wanted to come out the other end of all of this as a work-based learning specialist. And what I'm doing right now, yes, that gives me the context within which you can understand work-based learning. But it's the same for teachers who are training. They're in work-based learning context. Lawyers, doctors, they're all in work-based learning context. They are working and studying at the same time. And that's what I wanted to make the kind of focus. And so I had to fight to keep it that way. And I had to keep reminding him, this is my doctorate. I'm paying for this. And as much as I appreciate the guidance, this is my emphasis. This is where I want to take it, rather than ticking some kind of boxes to satisfy some funding body or something like that. So hence I'm laughing.
Yeah.
It was more about defending that position and staying constant within it.
Yeah. So I'd love to tease this out a little, because I think that this is a very, foundational experience. This is a common-ish experience, right, across the PhD journey, is that you are continually defending sort of positions when you get to maybe different levels. But then at the same time, you're also learning and taking the guidance. And can you just speak a little bit more to that balance of being in an educational program, you're learning from your supervisors and from the faculty, and staying open while also having a firm approach coming in, and then this responsibility to really defend your research as well. Can you just speak a little bit more to how you might have approached that experience?
It was difficult.
Yeah.
The three supervisors that I had, the one, and she made this very clear from the start, and I wanted her to be my supervisor, was that she was not religious, but she had religious sympathies. And a lot of her research was around this within education in schools. So, for example, religious instruction and whether people felt the freedom to share their own values and so on. And I wanted that more so than anything else, because my own positioning, even at that point in time, was not quite central or core. I was on the verges of a lot of things. So I didn't want to get pulled into something in the core, because that's not where I was personally myself in any way. Whereas the other two were a lot more conventional. Now, you're right in that having to defend my own position actually in the long run was really helpful, because the viva was coming at the end of this entire process in any way. And so you were beginning to learn to formulate your own position, how to defend that position, how to defend it in such a way that you're not just talking about your own sense of conviction or values, but actually undergird that with good theoretical underpinnings, frameworks, etc., but also at the same time, it's quite stressful. They found it. They were quite shocked. During my mock viva, as we were about to start, they asked me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, but just to let you know," and I kind of raised my top slightly. I said, "I am fitted with a heart monitor," and their eyes all went as big as saucers. And it's just, it's a stressful process. Life becomes stressful. You're stressed about it. You kind of get one go at this, because if you don't pass your level 8, you end up with another MA sort of thing. So the stress is on you. So the defense thing is not just about a kind of a cognitive defense, learning how to intellectually defend this. It's also about building up the emotional resilience to deal with what can come across as quite hard criticism. I mean, my mock viva, I almost burst into tears at the end of it, because the person that they brought in, blimey, she absolutely took me through the works. And rightfully so. It's a mock viva. They really gave me a good tasting of what potentially could be my viva. My viva was amazing, by the way. It was way easier than the mock viva. But you have to develop that sense of emotional resilience. It's not just about the intellect. It's also about the emotions. So all of that is part of that development of defending your work from an intellectual point of view, but also from an emotional point of view, building that thick skin, which now, many years later, you begin to realize, blimey, you really do need a thick skin in higher education, from, journal review article rejections or the feedback you get from reviewers, because some of them can be extremely harsh. So it all kind of actually sets you up for this life of an academic that you now live in anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you said something earlier, you were just very clear on the why and the what of the work that you do. And I think that is so important when you get into this process, because of the resilience that you build in different ways, being able to come back to sort of what brought you into it the first place is a grounding place to be, being able to come back to something during some of those experiences. Yeah.
And again, if I reflect back on this, a lot of what I do now in work-based learning is career identity. And it's fascinating how much of that I had to go through myself.
Mm,
Knowing the what and the why is part of knowing who I am,
mm,
my sense of identity.
yeah.
And when that's resisted, or when you get negative feedback, you can either implode, or I've just recently completed some research on the imposter syndrome, and again,
Mm,
it's about this career identity. How do you form careers? When you transition between careers, how do you transition those identities again? So
mm,
a lot of what I went through during my own doctoral process is quite core to what I do now in the
mhm.
actual day-to-day work I do.
And so, talk a little bit, or could you share a little bit about like ways to manage the stress, become emotionally resilient, like strategies, practical advice that you might be able to share to other folks navigating this that worked for you, or you knew worked for some of your colleagues, etc.
Definitely. Supervise PhD students at the moment. I've just completed two who've been successful in their vivas literally a couple of months ago. And
Amazing.
they've gone through very similar things as well. So I'll rattle off a few that come to mind, which I think are really important. The first one is getting into healthy habits, and I think this is really important. It's you in it for the long haul. You have to. Time management is very important. Don't
Mm,
fall behind. Stick to set yourself deadlines. If your supervisor does that with you, stick to them. Work towards those deadlines. So time frames are really, really important, particularly in a big piece of work like a PhD. You can very quickly fall behind. So time management is a really important one. Linked to time management is life management. Again, a lot of people are engaged in other kinds of commitments, whether be it work or family. You've got to figure out what works. You can't be pondering that for 6 months. You got to figure that out within the first month, because otherwise you'll fall behind. So for me, I agreed with the family that they would let me have 2 evenings a week and 1 weekend a month. And that's what I had. So I had to make sure that I went into those times very clear about what I was going to do during them, the amount of time I had to do what I needed to do, no procrastination. I had to be very focused. This was the time I had, and I had to get things done. So I
mm,
could plan out every single month the progress I was wanting to achieve, making sure that I didn't wait too long to get a supervisor's feedback on a piece of work, because I needed to then work on it during those times. And I stuck to them. I also then had to defend that with the family, saying, look, as much as I know this is important, we've agreed that this is my time. Go without me. It's okay. Just bring me back some cake or whatever if there was a party going on or something like that. So
yeah.
just sticking to that routine. Once it becomes routine, it actually becomes easier, because then
Mhm,
everybody around you becomes used to that. You become used to that, and actually
mhm,
they then support you in that, to kind of stick to those things. The other one is also very practical, and that's around health, because of the high stress levels, and it's hard. Your brain is a muscle; it gets tired focusing on things like this. Making sure that you're eating properly, you have healthy food habits, you're getting exercise, you're getting out, you're breathing fresh air. When you're not working, that you are actually recovering, you're relaxing, you're doing that intentionally, and then just keeping track of things. So one of the things I did, which was one of the revisions I had to do after my viva, is you are reworking your work so many times, you forget, was that a direct quote or was I paraphrasing? And one of my examiners was somebody that I was actually quoting in my work. And they,
mm,
in the Viva, said, I don't remember saying that. And I was like, oh my gosh. And at that point in time, I realized that I had direct quoted, I then paraphrased, and then I couldn't remember whether that was a paraphrase. And then I just put the quotations back in and I'd misquoted because I'd lost
mm,
track, because I'd kept reworking and reworking. And again, I now, as I supervise, I keep telling my students, if it means keeping a research journal, or just keep track of your citations, keep track of drafts. Don't delete any drafts, keep them, because you'll probably refer back to them to figure out, was that a direct quote, was that a paraphrase, etc., etc. But you've got to be very, very organized. It's a massive big piece of work over a big period of time, and you don't want to get lost in it. So you have to be very organized. Those would be my top tips.
yeah, amazing. Thanks for sharing those. I think those are very helpful. And you mentioned you were, I think, one of six out of your cohort who made it through. Why do you think that was? Like, what did you do to make that happen?
Yes. The reason I'm laughing is because one of my colleagues, they didn't finish because they separated and went through a divorce.
Hmm.
And they jokingly said, retrospectively, try not to have any major life events, while doing a PhD, which is why we're
Yeah.
laughing. Not that you plan to have that, but,
Yeah.
try and minimize the amount of things you're doing at once, because a
Hmm.
PhD is enough.
Hmm.
So try not to plan a major move, like a house move, career change, obviously relationships, etc., etc. For others, it was a mixed bag of those kind of things. Actually, it was major life events that just overtook each other. Some people were made redundant, again, things they couldn't control. Others made career moves, an opportunity came about, they went for a promotion, and then they just realized, I just can't do a PhD anymore. For most of them, it was that. I would probably say maybe 1 out of the 20 odd that started, it was funding, but the vast majority was some big life event overtook the PhD and it fell by the wayside. That other thing became the priority.
Hmm. Hmm.
Again, I was very clear that I wanted this and I was not going to give up hell or high water. I was going to pursue this, even if it meant sitting with a heart monitor strapped to my chest. I was going to complete it. Yeah, but I was just very determined. I was extremely, extremely determined. And as I said, there were 6 of us that graduated in the end out of a group of 20 or so.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that's probably uncommon. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's kind of interesting to think about as well, because you become attached to your cohort and they're a big part of the process. And so when you see that, when you see others taking, deciding to move in different directions, whether because of the promotions or life events, et cetera, like, you have to continually grapple with that yourself. And, am I here for it? Or, what is my decisions or choices as you're navigating that? So I think that's valuable to know. So tell it. So I here in the U.S. maybe it's a dissertation, but I'm sort of understanding it might be a viva within your context. Am I understanding that right? Are these the same things or?
Yes, yes. So my wife is Estonian, and
Uh-huh.
they do vivas at undergrad level already, which is
Wow.
just phenomenal. That makes me want to run for the hills. I didn't have it in my master's. I did a master's at the University of Brighton in England, a
Mhm.
10,000-word dissertation, research dissertation. You just handed in, and again, it got marked. But the EdD process that we were involved in, so like I said, we had 7 modules. Every single module you had to pass and progress. If you didn't get through the first one, you'd have to keep trying and you'd get 3 tries. And if
I
that's
see.
it, and that was the other one actually, is that because it was a modular driven process, some dropped out because they just weren't meeting those deadlines. You
Hmm.
can't just keep expanding. You got to meet extenuating circumstances to get an
Hmm.
extension, and they just didn't prioritize, and so they didn't complete the modules. They didn't get to the research phase,
Yep.
so they exited with postgrad diplomas and so on and so on. But yeah, our
Mhm.
EdD process, so 7 modules, roughly around 6,000 words per module in terms of an assignment, and then we
Okay.
finished off with a research dissertation or thesis of around
Mhm.
50,000 words. So if you added up all the 7 modules and the 50,000, you'd end up around 120,000 words, which is similar to a PhD process. So it's just how they've broken it up. But then, yes, once you've handed in your dissertation, you then have to choose an internal examiner, which is from the university, an external examiner, so quite often an expert within the field, which was the person I was quoting.
Mhm.
And then you have to sit in front of them and defend your thesis. So they will go through all the different chapters and challenge you on certain things.
Yeah.
And then you will come out of that either fail or pass with no corrections, pass with minor corrections, or pass with major corrections. And this
Mhm.
is pretty much the UK standard. So the 2 students that I've just finished supervising on a PhD, they've gone through a very similar process. The one passed with major corrections and the other one passed with minor corrections.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then, of course, as long as you hand in those corrections, fixing up your thesis, which then goes into the British Library, you will be given the title of doctor. If you fail
Mhm.
to then hand in a corrected thesis, you'll
I see. Yeah, that's helpful. And so from your thesis, like what were some of your biggest findings and how have they influenced your thinking since?
So, I mean, my biggest finding from a theoretical perspective was really understanding and getting to grips with what is the point of higher education. We've had quite a bad rhetoric in the UK now, this year, last year, the year before that, with the phrase that's been coined, particularly within politics, what is the value of a degree? and that word
Mm,
value underlined, highlighted. My
mhm,
thesis was all about that, that it's not just about a piece of paper. It's not just about knowledge acquisition. It's about the formation of citizens and those citizens' contribution in society, be it economically, politically, ideologically, etc., etc. So I would not be able to engage in those discussions. And I actually published a paper with a colleague of mine earlier this year on that, talking about work-based learning and how the skill development process is an added dimension from work-based learning to knowledge acquisition. So that's all coming from my thesis. In terms of my research, again, what I found fascinating was most of the participants in my research were Church of England curates, so training to become priests, as I said, his late 40s and older. They were looking at this as their final career move. So they weren't looking to become qualified to progress. This was it.
mm,
And hence, for some of them, this resistance to, well, why do I need another degree? I'm not going to use that degree for anything. And hence my discussion, well, is that what a degree is? Is a degree a degree just to get a job or to
mhm.
get progress in a job? Isn't it about the forming of you as a person in the process of that critical thinking, being a
Yeah.
critical citizen, et cetera, et cetera? And the primary data findings confirmed that there is a huge amount of misperception around what is the purpose of a degree. And I still think nowadays we're constantly being pushed down this road that it's about the economic cogs. And if it doesn't, if the economic cogs don't need this particular qualification or doesn't value this kind of qualification, well, why do we have it? I think
Mhm,
there's a broader reasoning behind it, and the role of
mhm,
professionalism in society, professional citizens, these kind of things. So that was all extremely profound. And I continue to develop my research and my writing around that, particularly the area of reflection.
mhm,
Um, you know, we don't just reflect. It's not like you wake up in the morning and you're just an absolutely brilliant reflective practitioner. It's a skill
mhm,
and an understanding of why. I'm sure you've come across people, your listeners have come across people where they may say, well, that's just what I think. If people don't like it, well, they can lump it or leave it.
mhm,
That's a clear indication of a lack of reflective development, emotional intelligence, the
mhm,
recognition of what impact you have on other people. That's all reflection. And reflection is a core component in work-based learning because we
mm,
don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. And this,
mhm.
again, was a very core component that came out in my research.
Amazing. Wow. And the misperception of the degree of why accomplishing a degree, I was curious, like, is that coming from just like sort of the broader society or within even like those who are obtaining the degree?
Yes. And again, I think there is a lack of understanding as to, why were universities started in the first place. It wasn't about providing economic cogs in a system. It was about developing certain elements of society to
Mm,
look after society, hence doctors, lawyers, clergy who had key
mhm,
roles in English society
mhm,
as the first
mhm,
professions. There's some brilliant work by, oh my gosh, now you're testing my memory here from my PhD. I think her name was Britta, but it talks about professionalism. It talks about what's called pre-techno pre-technocratic knowledge, technocratic knowledge, and post-technocratic knowledge. And post-technocratic knowledge is that higher level of reflective, critical understanding that
mm,
somebody develops, which then is exercised within society in their civil roles.
mm,
And education originally started out with that in mind. Hence, your more vocational places like plumbers and electricians were sent to vocational colleges where you learned the trade. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you hit your finger with a hammer and you swear that now you're going to get disbarred from your
mhm,
trade. That's kind of
mhm,
almost, there's that level of kind of moralism, self-regulation just didn't exist within those trades and still doesn't in some ways. It's more kind of around bureaucratic stuff about corruption and those kind of things. But those upper tiers, particularly where you look at organizations that self-regulate. So we have the General Medical Council. In other words, the
mhm,
General Medical Council holds doctors accountable within their own system of
mm,
self-regulation. They're not held accountable by somebody else. They're held accountable by their own very peers. Now, how do you
mm,
become one of those peers? Education. And it's not just about the knowledge, but it's about the formational process of those peoples within society. And it's that kind of thing that I think we've lost the heart of. And AI has really brought this back to mind again. Well, why do
mm,
I need to go to university to learn stuff when I
Yeah.
can just ask AI to tell me that, because that's not what education is. We've lost the heart of what education was originally. Considering the fact that, when education first started, when universities were first formed, people couldn't read and write. We now just take that for granted, particularly in the developed world. And we don't consider, well, how did we get here? These people that did learn to read and write then established that within educational systems within the world. And hence we have schooling systems now where we aim to have our populations literate. This is all part of education. It's not just about learning, business management skills so you can become a rich businessman and write up business plans. It's about who you become as a wealthy business person. It's those character elements, et cetera, et cetera. And we've lost that, I think, in today's society. And I think it's driven by a lot of globalization, and it's driven by a lot of economics, sadly, where people just become cogs in a system to feed an economical system. There's more to life in the world than economical systems. We see a lot of people exiting those systems and creating different lifestyles.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, and you're doing a lot now on like disseminating your knowledge. Can you talk a little bit around like how you view dissemination of knowledge, like some of the things that you partake in, and how you maybe kind of got to that place?
One of the things my students, and particularly when I do training and development with bigger companies, one of the things they say to me, you're very different as a teacher, trainer, lecturer. And I always like to tease that out. I think I know why, but I like to tease it out just to check that I'm still on the right track. And I say, why is that? They said, well, you don't just teach content. You don't just teach a book. You actually try and get inside me, and you rattle around inside me. Sometimes you upset me, and other times you make me a better person. And then I smile and I say, yep, that's me. And I think that's the kind of disseminating kind of work I do. Yes, I publish so that these kinds of things can constantly be a challenge to potentially maybe the run-of-mill thinking around these kind of things. But I've always said it to my students, the day that a university or an organization expects me just to teach a textbook, that's the day I'll pack in. That's the day I'll retire. I'm about, and I say to them, hand on heart, I'm here because I can influence you as a person. Now, that might sound scary, and as long as I'm doing that in an ethical way, it should be okay. And I'm not trying to suggest that my way of viewing the world or my perceptions of the world has to be your perceptions or views. But I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what are the views and perceptions you have. How will you be as an employer, as a manager, as a leader in society? And what would that impact and influence have on other people? And how can I help you to be a better manager and be a better leader? Not the kind of leader where you are the only person that benefits, but everyone benefits around you because of the way you are. Growing your emotional intelligence, growing your reflective ability, being able to own what you are and who you are, and empowering you to know how to improve yourself. And that's the kind of stuff that I disseminate. So I produce YouTube videos to share some of these ideas. I use a teaching method called dual coding. Basically what it means is I create a lot of metaphors and analogies to explain complex concepts in a way that it makes sense. So when I talk about research, I have it right here because I always use it. I use my little bottle of marbles. And I describe data like marbles. So, your marbles are either numbers or your marbles are either words. You put them into a jar. So if you're an undergrad, it's a small bucket. If you're a postgrad, it's the bucket you wash your car with. And once you've collected the right amount of marbles, you then pour them out on the floor and you need to sort them. That's your data analysis. So I use these kinds of dual coding methods to explain complex concepts, and including additional aspects, professionalism, reflection, etc., etc. So I create YouTube videos on that. I have my own podcast as well, where I interview guests on these kind of things, particularly guests who are also thinking a little bit outside the box, and to kind of tease it out like you're doing with me today. And then, of course, my publications by some of my books that I've produced over there for senior leaders, and other kinds of material. And that's kind of what I try and do and influence. Again, I'm getting quite involved at the moment on MBAs around the world. So I'm teaching on 2 different kinds of MBAs at the moment in Kazakhstan, which is an emerging market nestled nicely, neatly between China and Russia. So a lot of different kinds of worldviews and working with those students to try and help them to think that through. What are their models? What are their role models? What is the reason and the purpose of leadership or management, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's a kind of international angle of disseminating some of my thinking as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, but it sounds like it all has the common thread that you mentioned up front. And I think like there is a lot of opportunity for folks post program to think, there's just so much opportunity today to disseminating your knowledge and even in new ways that maybe weren't just this traditional sort of publication route. And so I think it's really valuable to hear that. And then maybe with all of the options, just making sure it aligns with sort of what your mission or what your sort of work is in and aligning that. So thanks for sharing. And what's one thing that you're currently working on that really excites you right now that you could share with us?
So I've my colleague and I have just submitted, as a colleague I work for at the University of Kent, we've just submitted an article which we think is quite groundbreaking in some ways. Not groundbreaking as in we're going to get a Nobel Peace Prize or anything like that, but quite groundbreaking in terms of what's out there. And what we've done is we've looked at authentic leadership as a concept, as a definition. Authentic leadership itself is quite a new research concept. Paired that with what we call the dark triad or dysfunctional leadership, narcissism, psychopathy, these kinds of things. I mean, really extreme understandings. And the reason why we've done this is I'm coming across more and more on LinkedIn and so on, people using the phrase imposter syndrome. Now, the opposite of imposter syndrome is what's called strategic imposterism. So this is where somebody on purpose acts as if they are an imposter in order to gain status, gain influence, gain power. Whereas an imposter syndrome or an imposter phenomena is somebody who genuinely, extremely intellectual, extremely clever, but genuinely doesn't think that they earn the merit on things that they have accomplished and achieved. And that's the imposter phenomena. And they're completely different, right? So the one is actually a genuine good person and they actually do genuinely good things. They just don't believe in themselves. And the other person is somebody who actually is genuinely not very good, but they try to pull the wool over your eyes. And so what we've done is we've created a conceptual framework for both of these, so that we can more clearly understand the differences between them, but also therefore then understand more clearly the understanding and idea of authentic leadership. Again, there's a misunderstanding, particularly in today's contemporary politics, where authenticity is, well, they just say it as it is. What they see is what you get. Yeah, but that's not necessarily authenticity. Authenticity is that recognition of what impact I have on somebody else and not trying to mask it or hide it. Taking responsibility for my own decisions, particularly when they're bad decisions, and not trying to blame or shift the blame, because again, that's what we call impression management. And we all do that to some degree, so it's not like it's wrong or right, but it's understanding the clear differences. And I find this quite exciting research, particularly because I'm beginning to do a lot more work around MBAs, which are middle managers and executives. I'm going out to Kazakhstan soon again to teach executives an executive MBA. And I think, again, my own value position and identity formation is about wanting to influence and shape as many authentic leaders as I can, rather than the kind of leaders that just take power and control for themselves. And everyone else is negatively affected. So I'm quite excited about this and the potential that this may develop and hopefully shape our world to be a bit of a better place for all of us to live in.
Yeah, that's amazing. Did you say you just submitted it? Is that where it's at?
Yes.
Okay, so not
It
available yet.
went through quite a few journals, so we finally
Okay.
found the right home for it, which you all know is one of the challenges of publication. It's not always that the article's not right, it's about you haven't found the right home. They
Yeah.
haven't come back and said this isn't the right home, which says to me that it's gone out to review now. So
Okay.
now I'm waiting for the reviewers to come back, and hopefully, our foot's in the door. It's in, and we just need to keep working on it to meet the criteria of the journal. So looking forward to that being published, hopefully sometime this year.
Yeah, fantastic. Likewise. Best of luck with that. So, sort of to wrap us up here, I have two questions that I ask each guest, and I'd like to jump into those. The first one here is, what's one book, podcast, or article that you'd recommend that every PhD student should read or listen to?
Oh my goodness. I'm probably going to go down the route of a book. It's a good old favorite. It's by Robert Keegan from Harvard University in the US. He writes from a cognitive psychology point of view. My undergrad degree is in psychology, and I've just rediscovered it, and I
Mm-hmm.
am just engrossed.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard reading. You've got to kind of reread it to kind of really get your head around it. And he talks about 5 stages that we go through as adults, and that the first stage, you have to get through the first stage in order to progress to the next stage, unlike other stages of development that we come across, Piaget and so on and so on. But
Mm-hmm.
what is quite interesting is how everybody does have the potential to progress through these stages. You can see my career identity stuff coming in here again. But it's what I'm finding intriguing about the book at this point in time is how do we support somebody else who we recognize may be at a stage below us? So rather than getting angry and annoyed and disappointed and, you're wrong, I'm right, but it's a recognition, actually, I've progressed into a different stage. That's great. But now I have a responsibility to, and this could be in relationships, for example, where people fall out of love. They might just be in different stages. And it's rereading the book in such a way to recognize how to support others to continue to progress in their stages and how to be patient with them. I like it because I can see it when I supervise PhD students. They are going through a transition as they are in the process of the PhD. And I could almost recognize those stages. Again, wow, Keegan, where have you been all my life? I read you many, many years ago, and it's just flooding back in again. And I'm appreciating what it means to me personally, but also what it could mean to others that I'm around and influencing and shaping. So that would be it. Robert Keegan's books around cognitive development stages.
Yeah.
It's hard reading, but it's worth the effort.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I think it's saying something that you're revisiting it here again and still finding it quite valuable. So I think that's a great sign. So fantastic. We'll link to that one. And if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice before starting your PhD, what would it be?
I think we'd first have probably like a 10, 20-minute argument, and then we'll finally get to the advice. But there's been so much change. You said very graciously, you watched my TEDx talk, and it's a clear indication of how different I am now. And what advice would I give my younger self? This is going to go quite deep. I think I would say to my younger self, look after your mental health. I've been through, if you've watched my TEDx talk, I've been through a number of major life transitions and discovered transformative learning as a result of it. But I kind of, again, here's my analogies coming out, right? Sometimes when we go through life and we go through a struggle, it's either a break or it's a strain. So sometimes, you can hear somebody saying, oh, they broke me. Oh, I'm broken. Actually, a break is quite good, because when a bone breaks, it actually grows back stronger than it was. And that's good. We can't avoid difficulties in life, but the key is that it's a break and not a strain. A strain happens over a longer period of time, like a muscle. Think about a footballer or a professional athlete. Once that hamstring strains and then starts to tear, their career is done. They just can't recover from it. And it continues to be this injury that keeps surfacing time and time again. And I think I look back on my life and there are certain strains which I can't get rid of, that they've now become a part of who I am. And I wish as a younger self, I was a little bit more wise, recognizing that this could potentially become a strain. And I could have avoided it by, my analogy again, stretching, looking after my mental muscles, particularly my emotional muscles, in order to to continue to have that sense of resilience, particularly among Gen Z. A lot of research is saying they're struggling. And this is one of the biggest things that I'm trying to say to them is look after your mental health. Don't strain. A break is fine. We can't avoid difficult things, but don't allow a strain, because you're going to struggle. It will haunt you for the rest of your life. That would be my advice to my younger self.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you gave us 4 key takeaways earlier to think about managing and or building some emotional resilience. So I think to the listeners, reflect back on those. But this is quite lovely. And we didn't really get to talk about the TEDx talk either, but it was quite fantastic and would highly recommend it. Listen for any listeners, and I will link to that. And just well done. I think that was a couple of years ago that you had shared that. So fantastic job. It was just really a great listen for myself, at least. So I think others would enjoy it. So Trevor, thank you so much for joining today, for sharing your journey, for sharing a lot of wise wisdom. And so really appreciate it. Where can people follow your work or connect? Like, where's the best place for them to follow your work or connect with you, learn more about what you're doing?
Before I share that, thank you, Ali, for the opportunity. Thank you for your gracious hosting. Really do appreciate that. Thankfully, there's not many Trevor Gerhardts in the world. So if you opened up Google and you put my name and surname in, there's one guy in America, I think he's an electrical engineer, and there's me that will pop up at least on the first 2-3 pages. And then you'll find my academic work, you'll find my books, you'll find the YouTube channel, you'll find my website. And so that's probably the quickest and easiest thing to do, is just Google my name and surname. If you really don't want to do that because you're worried about what else may pop up, just add me on LinkedIn, Dr. Trevor Gerhardt. Again, search for me, and most of what I do and most of what I've published, YouTube channels again, etc., is linked. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you'll be able to pick most of those things up from my LinkedIn channel in any way as well.
Perfect. Well, I will make sure to link out to that as well. So again, appreciate it. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your work.
Thank you very much. And again, thanks for the opportunity.
What a great conversation with Dr. Trevor. I thought he had a lot of valuable insight to share. I loved that he had 4 key takeaways to build emotional resilience in the program: the time management, life management, taking care of your health, as well as keeping track of things. So super relevant, actionable, practical tips right there for any listener who's in a PhD program or out of a PhD program, really. I also just really enjoy an international view of the doctorate, because I think here in the United States, we have a very particular process. And although it is very similar across the world, that there are some ins and outs, maybe even just a little bit of a change in language on the programs. And as the world is becoming more globalized, or we might be interested in international research or insights, that it's really helpful to better understand that process overall. So what resonated with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop me a message or a comment. And thank you for tuning in to Connected. You can find all of the links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone in your PhD community. And be sure to follow along on LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube for more conversations just like this. So I hope that I see you next time, and let's stay connected.